Hello, I would like to welcome everyone to our 8th annual Nelson Mandela Day of Social Justice here at the University of Southern Indiana. I'm Dr. Wendy Turner. I'm a professor of social work in the Department of Social Work here at USI. And I'm very pleased to be able to present our speaker for you today, the keynote for this annual event. I want to ask you in this webinar, if you have questions or comments, please use the Q&A. We will be moderating. The chat is not open to be used. So you will post your questions in the Q&A. And at the end of the talk, our speaker has allowed some time at the end that we can address those questions. So please type all of your questions in the Q&A portion. So I will now like to introduce you to our keynote speaker. As the recipient of the Mark T. Banner Award from the American Bar Association and the Hugh M. Hefner First Amendment Award, Simon Tam may be best known for winning a landmark case at the Supreme Court of the United States in 2017. The case, Mattal versus Tam, was named Milestone Case of the Year for Managing IP Magazine. His memoir, Slanted: How an Asian American Troublemaker Took on the Supreme Court, was named one of the best books on the Constitution of all time by Book Authority and won an award for Best Autobiography Memoir from the Independent Publisher Book Awards. Simon's work in arts and activism has been highlighted in thousands of media features across 129 countries, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Rolling Stone, NPR, and The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. He's the founder and bassist of the Slants, one of the first all-Asian American dance rock bands in the world. He's also a co-founder of the Slants Foundation, a nonprofit organization that is pushing the boundaries of what is possible for arts, activism, and civic engagement. And CPOC Music, the first music business conference for artists of color. In 2016, Simon joined President Barack Obama, George Takei, Jeremy Lin, and other celebrities in the #ActChange campaign to fight bullying. Simon has also worked with other music icons such as Jay-Z, Killer Mike, and Chance the Rapper on legislative efforts to protect artistic expression. Simon believes that apathy is not compatible with love. His passion for ideas that combine arts and activism is evident in all of his work, from his music to his writing. He works to change the culture by transforming systems with an equity framework, all while holding down harmony and rhythm on the bass guitar. Today, he's accompanied by Jiang, guitarist for the Slants and co-founder of the Slants Foundation. And I'd like to welcome Simon Tam to USI.
This land is your land, this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. This land was made for you and me.
You know, hearing the jangly melodic overture of Woody Guthrie's iconic song always takes me back to elementary school, where a choir of high-pitched children's voices would sing this out along with other patriotic folk songs like God Bless America and Battle Hymn of the Republic. It just reminds me that music really is a time capsule. Pop melodies are fused with the biggest moments of our lives. And as we do that, they can also unearth sentiments and visions that are often buried long ago with just a simple refrain. And like any cachet of goods stored away, each person approaches music with their own highly specific meaning that passes through their own filters and their own requirements. I mean, it's why many couples have their song. It's why many people, sports teams, organizations, they all have a theme song to help them get pumped up as well. And it's also why we have specific music during ceremonial moments in our lives, like birthdays, weddings, and funerals. Now, that's because I believe that music is a ceremony. It is a ritual. It's a celebration in of itself. And though Woody Guthrie borrowed melodies from When the World's on Fire, a song by the Carter family, and an old Baptist hymn called Oh, My Living Brother for his song. This Land Is Your Land would eventually surpass both of those songs in popularity and impact. It was actually recorded in a marathon session in April of 1944 for Folkaway Records when Guthrie was on shore leave from the Merchant Marines. But it wasn't actually released until 1951, and it was done so without the original, more radical verses that protested income inequality. I think this is sometimes because ceremony or the ceremony of music can be a little too controversial, too radical for its time. You know, when I hear the words from California to the New York Island, this land is made for you and me, I just can't help but have this knee-jerk reaction and think that it wasn't exactly true. Because when it was recorded in 1944, our country was locking families of Japanese descent into concentration camps. Desegregation was still a decade away, and tribal rights were being stripped away from Native Americans and indigenous peoples. If you fast forward over 70 years later to today, in the wake of the battles over the kinds of books that are being banned from schools, you'll still find that more than a few people are wondering just exactly who this land was made for. So even though it's been over 75 years since this land was captured on tape, in many ways it still feels like that it was ahead of its time. I'm reminded that the land, the very earth that we walk upon, is greater than the country. It's greater than any of the bricks or any of the buildings or any of the roads that we lay down. It spans the arbitrary lines on any map. It was here long before us, and it will continue to be here after we're gone. In other words, we just temporarily occupy it. Salish, the common ancestral language of the indigenous tribes of the Pacific Northwest, has an idea that is actually even older than their words. This idea that the people are of the land and the land is of the people, that they're kindred spirits that are alive and inseparable. I think it's actually a beautiful notion, this idea that the land and the people are tied together, because inherent in this idea is this idea of dignity, that the land and that the people in it are deserving of dignity. And most importantly, it's important for us to remember that dignity itself is inherent. In 2011, our band was invited to play at the Oregon State Penitentiary, or OSP, the maximum security prison in Oregon. Now, as a Johnny Cash fan, I was excited. I mean, I was planning on wearing all black that day. But it never occurred to me that the idea of sending an all-Asian band into a prison with one of the largest neo-Nazi populations in this country would be particularly dangerous. Not until we were actually going through our second set of metal detectors. And that's when our IDs were taken away from us. And instead, we were given these kind of bright orange jerseys with these huge numbers on them, like we were going to go play flag football or something. And that's what we were supposed to wear for the day, making us look more like kids in the junior high PE class than a rock and roll band. At one point, the singer of my band asked the guard, "Hey, we wear suits and vests when we play. It's really hot out there. Is it okay if we remove the jerseys when we're on stage?" And the guard looks at us. So he says, "Sure. But if something happens out there, those things let us know who not to shoot." So of course I'm like, "Yo, can I get 2 of them vests?" I mean, I didn't want to lose mine. And as we make our way through the prison, I start to realize how little of the system I actually knew, or how little I even knew about the people behind the bars there. Everything that I knew came from books, television shows, and movies, and they didn't exactly have very good things to say about the incarcerated. This was years before Orange is the New Black was even on television, so I wasn't even thinking about the prison industrial complex to uphold white supremacy. I just thought it's a maximum security prison means it's the worst of the worst, right? Like drug dealers, rapists, murderers. Well, we kind of make our way through the prison, and we eventually arrive at what they call the big yard. The big yard is this outdoor space that's a little bit bigger than a football field. It's surrounded by these huge, thick concrete walls with these sentry towers where you can see the searchlights and the mounts for weapons. And at the end of the big yard was a small concrete stage, and that's where we were supposed to play that day. I astutely noticed that the only thing that was going to be separating us from what was soon to be about 2,000 inmates was a small line of plastic thin tape. It just said, "Police, do not cross." So of course, I turned to the guard to say, "Hey, I don't know if they follow those kinds of rules. I mean, that's why they're here, right? They literally don't follow the rules." The guard looks at me, he says, "Don't worry, we got a plan." Of course, I'm like, "Well, what is it?" And he says, "Well, if something happens out there, like a fight breaks out or you're in danger, we just need you to just drop your things and run behind you towards that chain link fence that's behind the stage. We'll be on the other side, so when you're through, we'll just go ahead and secure it." I'm like, all right, let me get this straight. If something happens out there, like our lives are on the line, we're in danger, your plan is for us to just drop everything and run. You'll be on the safe side, and if we make it through in time, that's when you'll lock it down? Oh, well, I wouldn't say it like that, but yeah. And I'm like, where did you get this plan? From The Walking Dead? I mean, I felt like they even had a better plan. I thought this is the government, that you're full of best practices to protect us, that you have experience, a system, wisdom to handle these kinds of things. Well, eventually, we take the stage. And I gotta say, something magical happens every time when we have a chance to share our art, our music with people. We're not thinking about the criminal status of folks we're presenting with. We're just sharing something that is deeply meaningful to us. It's just expression. And I'll never forget that this small crowd just begins to grow and grow and right in front of us. And as we launch into our cover of Painted Black, I'll never forget as we just begin watching this crowd jump up and down to the music.
I see a red door and I want it painted black. No colors anymore, I want it to turn black. I see the girls walk by dressed in their summer clothes. I have to turn my head until my darkness goes.
At the end of the show, I'm standing there by that line of police tape, on the safe side, of course, and a small group of large white men start approaching. They're covered head to toe in tattoos. As they get closer, I notice that the man in front has 2 words carved into his chest: white power. That feeling of anxiety begins to grow inside of me again. I mean, he's getting closer and closer, and he looks a bit anxious himself. He's about an arm's length away from me when he reaches out and hands me a piece of paper and a very sharp pencil. I'm frozen. Like the only thing going through my mind at that moment is that scene in Jurassic Park where they say, "Hey, if you don't move, the T-Rex can't see." But obviously it's too late. He already saw me. But then he says those 4 words that just cuts right through me. "It's for my daughter. Will you please sign it?"
His skin was stained with stories of pain, but he wanted to change. Will you let him? Can you believe his ask for forgiveness in his daughter's name? Can you forget him? Do people live forever, imprisoned by state? Nothing could be done to earn a little grace. Did you think we couldn't get this far? This is who we are, this is who we are. And did you think we couldn't get this far? This is who we are, this is who we are.
So we just had this short exchange, and it's mostly me asking him questions like, "Well, what grade is your daughter in?" And avoiding questions like, "So why are you in here?" I mean, it seemed kind of obvious. I couldn't follow instructions. But as we're talking, he says, I can't change what's stained into my skin, but I could change what's in here. And I could change what's in here. He told me that he made a lot of mistakes in this life, and they were ones that he didn't want his little girl to make. It was probably one of the most powerful experiences that I ever had as a musician, because we walked in there and we were just full of assumptions. And I'm sure when he and his friends saw a group of Asian people on stage that they had their own thoughts as well. And technically, I was literally judging him by his skin. I mean, granted, it said white power up in there, but once we actually had a chance to engage and see the humanity in each other, we both walked away changed that day. That is the power of giving each other grace, when we could see the humanity in each other. When you recognize and when you respect the dignity that is inherent in others, you'll never know what kind of change that you can inspire in them. Like the land that we are tied to, it is bigger than you and me. And I grew up in San Diego, California in the 1980s. And back then we didn't have any kind of social mirrors or representation in the media, really. I mean, this is decades before Crazy Rich Asians, Always Be My Maybe, or Fresh Off the Boat were killing it in the theaters and on TV screens. The only thing we had really were white actors like Mickey Rooney taping his eyes back and making a mock Japanese accent, or stereotypical characters like Long Duck Dong and 16 Candles. And I think that as a lack of this nuance or any kind of representation, it kind of contributed to me being bullied as a kid. I was attacked multiple times, but the incident that always jumps out at me was this one particular day in 7th grade. Back then, different students would kind of hang back after class to clean up the yard and PE while everyone else would go and hit the showers. And on this particular day, it was my turn. And I thought I was alone out there as I was picking up the volleyball nets, basketballs, and the other sports equipment. But then I could feel myself being shoved to the ground. As I look up, I see that there's 4 guys standing over me. But the thing that actually terrifies me the most is that they're smiling. They're grinning through this whole thing like they're enjoying the moment. And really, that's just when it begins, just over and over and over again. They began kicking me in the stomach. They began throwing sand in my eyes, hitting me in the face, all while yelling 2 words again and again: Jap and Gook. I was so terrified. I just didn't know how to respond until something in me just snaps at some point. I look at them and I said, hey, I'm a chink. Like, that's how stupid you are. You can't even be a racist properly. They were so surprised by this, they just stopped and they walked away. You see, I believe there's power in claiming an identity. There's power in saying, you don't get to define who I am. Only I get to do that. And I think part of this lesson carried over when I entered in high school. High school is where I met my friend Kyle. And of course, that's where I fell in love with the Ramones.
Well, I don't care about history. Rock, rock and roll high school, 'cause that's not where I wanna be. Rock and roll high school. I just wanna have some kicks. I just wanna get some chicks. Rock and roll high school.
Now, this is way before Hot Topic hit the mall anywhere near us. So the idea of me having this homemade wallet chain out of safety pins, well, nobody thought this thing was cool. Nobody except for Kyle. Now, one day Kyle shows up and he's got hot pink hair and it's spiked into Liberty spikes all over his head. And I was like, Kyle, you look so cool. You're so punk. Well, no one else at school felt that way. I mean, all day long, you could hear people laughing. You could see them pointing their fingers. You could see teachers giving him dirty looks. Now, I was supposed to meet Kyle after school this day, but I was running a bit behind. By the time I got there, a very familiar scene was unfolding before me. Kyle, now surrounded by about a dozen guys, were pushing him around and saying just horrible things. What are you, some kind of queer or something? And one of them says, how come your mom lets you walk out the door looking like that? And so I jump in, I said, hey, maybe it's because his mom's not stupid and ignorant like you. Maybe she doesn't judge people by what's on the outside, but by what's on the inside, because that's what counts. Now, I thought this was an excellent answer. I mean, I thought this is literally true. But of course, they didn't feel that way. They instead turned their heads toward me and they started pushing me around instead, calling me Jackie again and again. What's wrong, Jackie? What are you going to do, Jackie? And over again, all I could think of was like, yo, I'm in classes with a couple of you guys. You know my name's not Jackie. But that's when one of them says it, Jackie Chan. And all I could think was like, I'm not Jackie Chan. I mean, the man is significantly older than me. He's got this bulbous nose that's been busted so many times from doing all those stunts. But more importantly, Jackie knows something I don't, martial arts. Like he could school all these guys in a minute. I mean, I took 1 week at karate camp with my cousins in 5th grade, but they only gave me this white belt with this little yellow sticker on it out of pity. I didn't think it was going to help me out here. But I did think back on that 7th grade day and thought, well, maybe. So I struck the one karate pose that I could remember. And they were like, whoa, 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 whoa. Hey, we're just messing with you. Simon, right? Yeah, we're in classes with you. We're just messing around. It was the second time that claiming a stereotype actually helped me out in some kind of way. Now, I wish I could say that all my experiences in high school and junior high ended up this way with bravery and wit. But the reality is that it almost always ended the same way, with me running away, trying to find a place to hide, and just crying because I didn't want to get hit again. In 11th grade, I walked up to my dad and said, Dad, I'm ashamed of being Chinese. It just broke my parents' heart because they worked so hard for me and my siblings, but I was just tired of getting killed out there. You know, fast forward a couple of years later, and I'm graduating from UC Riverside on a double major, on a full ride scholarship, or I should say a few months from graduating, because then I had this brilliant idea of dropping out of college and moving across the country to join a punk rock band. Now, nobody told me before I moved to Portland that it actually has this nickname. You see, people like to call it America's whitest major city. And there, in America's whitest major city, I started missing my family's culture, hearing some of those first languages, seeing anyone who looked like me. And so in that state of loneliness, I would import all these movies from eBay, like VHS tapes shipped over from Hong Kong. It involved a lot of Hong Kong action films like those with Jackie Chan, because let's just face it, he's a straight up badass. And about this time period, some friends of mine said, hey, you like all those action movies? Have you ever watched Kill Bill? I mean, I missed it when it was in the theaters, but I did buy it the day it came out on DVD. It's April 2004, and I'll never forget, I'm just in my apartment watching this bright yellow disc with these 3 black lines slide into the player. As the movie begins, there's some witty banter and there's plenty of action, but there's this one particular scene that jumps out at me. This woman named Oranishi begins walking into this restaurant with her gang of crazy 88s. It's the Yakuza, or the Asian mafia that she leads. Now, to anybody else, this is just another trademark Quentin Tarantino scene. The music's blasting as people are walking in. You know, something is gonna go down. But for me, it was different. I mean, for me, it was the first time that I had ever seen an American-produced film that showed Asians as cool, confident, and sexy. And I thought, well, if Hollywood is bad, then the music industry is worse. There's over 17 million Asian Americans in this country. And at that point, we were never featured on Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, Spin Magazine, or even MTV back when they used to play music videos. And I knew that something needed to change. So that night, in the middle of the film, an idea for an Asian American band was born. But here's the thing. If you want to have a band, you got to have a name. So I started asking my friends in America's whitest major city, like, hey, what do you think all Asians have in common? And again, they would say slanted eyes. I'm like, slanted eyes? Like, first of all, it ain't true. Not all Asian people have slanted eyes. And second, we're not the only people on the planet with any kind of slant to our eyes. But I grew up hearing that stereotype. I knew what those experiences were like. So I thought, what if we could change it? Because as a kid who was bullied, I always associated my eyes with shame and embarrassment and fear. And what if we could flip it? What if we could change it from embarrassment to empowerment? What if we could change that story and what we associated with the term? So that's when the idea for the Slants was born. And never in my life could I imagine what would come next. When we launched this thing, kids from across the country started writing and sending us notes saying, thank you. Thank you for existing. Thank you for giving me a reason to be proud of my heritage. I mean, it was so incredible. We would get flooded with these messages on myspace.com, which lets you know how far back this thing goes. But it really helped me realize that whether we liked it or not, we would be judged on behalf of our community. So we really needed to kind of step up our game. We started taking some of our experiences and turning them to song. For the singer and myself, we were both bullied as kids from people walking up to us and saying things like Chinese, Japanese, dirty knees, look at these. And they just pulled their eyes back. We thought, why not take it, flip it upside down and turn it into an anthem of pride instead? And so that's when we got the idea for our song, Sakura Sakura.
We come from another school that doesn't wanna be the same. Against the greatest rhythm, social tempo is about to change. Then you see it and you eloquently wanna be the one, and then you reach it, it will burn you up like the rising sun. We sing for the Japanese and the Chinese and all the dirty knees can't see me. We sing in harmony. We sing for the Japanese and the Chinese and all the dirty knees can't see me. We sing in harmony.
So we started making all these headlines and getting radio play across this country. I mean, it was a lifelong dream that started to come true. And on top of that, we started working with community organizations across this country to help develop diversity, equity, inclusion programs. And we would work on these anti-bullying campaigns and participate in all kinds of festivals that would celebrate Asian and Pacific Islander culture. I mean, it really was a dream come true. Everything that I wanted since I was a kid, music and identity all rolled into one. But everything started falling apart, as it will, when I met an attorney. Now, Spencer is this IP attorney in Portland, Oregon, and he was introduced to me by our publicist. He's still a good friend of me, a friend of mine to this day. But one day he walks up to me and says, "Say, Simon, have you ever thought about applying to register for your band's trademark?" I'm like, "Nah, it sounds kind of expensive, Spencer." But he says, "No, it's only a few $100 and the whole thing will be over in about 6 months." He says it's important because bands need to get registered trademarks to be able to get record label deals and cut licensing agreements and that sort of thing. And so I guess it was worth a shot. So we decided to go ahead and move forward with that application. Well, a few months later, he calls me up and he says, "Hey, Simon, we got a problem. The trademark office has an issue with your name. They said the name of your band is disparaging to persons of Asian descent." And I'm like, wait, does disparaging mean what I think it means? Are they saying we're racist to Asian people? Like, I didn't even know there was a law against this. I mean, there's all kinds of offensive stuff out there. What does it actually say? And he begins to read me what they call Section 2A of the Lanham Act, which basically says that you can't register trademarks that are considered scandalous, immoral, or disparaging. But it's not just what anyone considers to be disparaging. They have to find what they call is a substantial composite of the reference group. So in this case, a lot of Asian people got to be upset for them to actually deny us this right. And I'm like, you know, we just toured nonstop across this country for the last couple of years. We played some of the biggest Asian American festivals in this country. We're doing outreach to our community for important causes. And sometimes we do this on behalf of the government. Like, who do they find who's offended by our name? And that's when he says, nobody. I'm like, wait, what do you mean nobody? You just said there has to be this substantial composite. Nobody doesn't sound like any composite. He says, nobody, but they did quote urbandictionary.com. And they used these photos of Miley Cyrus pulling her eyes back in a slant eye gesture. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. He says, no, I'm looking at Miley Cyrus right now. It's pretty offensive. I'm like, yeah, I know it's offensive. Like Asian Twitter was already up on that. But what you're telling me is that the federal government is using sources that isn't even acceptable in a junior high classroom to deny me rights. And he says, yes, they are. But I think they're wrong. If we could just appeal, if we could just show them how your community is supporting you, I think we could change their minds on this. We can and we should fight back.
Don't let the words dissuade, don't let the text prevail, don't let the weakness of others infect your health. Don't be their alibis, don't feed their greedy mouth. If it's time, then it's now. Stand up tall and fight back rather than just sit back. Claw your way through that feedback. Don't get caught in that, don't get caught in that. Just react, heart and mind remain intact. To the no will not retract. Lead the pack, it's your time now, it's your time now.
So how do you prove that you're not offensive to yourself? I mean, think about it. What would you do? In our situation, we decided to turn to our community. We worked with executive directors of numerous nonprofits. The social justice organizations all across the country rose up and they started writing letters in our support. We got dictionary experts, including one of the top linguistics experts of this country, who wrote this huge report over the history of the term slant. He showed that even the height of the 30s and 40s, the height of its use, it wasn't actually considered all that offensive, but how more often than not, Asian Americans were actually reappropriating the term, especially in the last few decades, so that we could shift the conversation in that self-empowering way. In addition to that, we even got some independent national surveys conducted that showed that over 90% of Asian Americans supported our use of the name. It was the most comprehensive survey and largest appeal in US history when it came to this law. But shortly after submitting this appeal with thousands and thousands of pages of evidence, the government wrote back and they said, it's not good enough. It's not good enough because urbandictionary.com says so. Then they used a British dictionary, not even an American dictionary, but a British one from the 1920s that described slant as a slur. So with a few keystrokes and a handful of abstract references, they basically wiped away the voices of our community. They called our effort, quote, laudable, but not influential. For them, it was more convenient to dismiss our evidence than to actually confront it. And on top of that, my attorney says, I've been working on this case for a few years now, and I'm burnt out on law, so you're going to have to find someone else to take it on. So I did a quick Google search, and I found this guy who wrote a blog about us. He seemed kind of smart. He's a lawyer, and he decided to take the case up pro bono. But he says, as long as you fight like this, you're not going to win. Here's the thing about the law. In the 70 years that it's been in existence, nobody has ever actually won on appeal when it came to a rejection of this kind. There's basically the government saying you can appeal if we get it wrong, but what they don't tell you is that you can never actually win. So we decided to change the conversation altogether. Sometimes whether it's in law or in art or community organizing, you have to be willing to take a different approach, and you have to look at things with fresh eyes and ears. It's saying that the overall idea of social change and justice, or the destination, is sometimes more important than the tactics that we use to bring it to life. When we're writing music and writing a song, it's amazing how new depths can be explored simply by moving a few words around, moving the tempo, or simply changing the key. And in our case, we decided to change the beat, so to speak, when it came to this legal argument. Instead of arguing and asking with them of like, if we were actually offensive, we started asking why. Why do you think this band is offensive? Because if slant is this inherent racial slur that you claim it is, well, how come you gave it to everybody else? You know, there have been over 800 applications for the word slant at the trademark office, but only one person in all of US history has ever been denied a trademark registration under this law. And that person was me. So why is that? Why is like Slant Shack, the slanted screen, slanted records, and everybody else okay? But when it came to the slants, all of a sudden it's not. Well, when we asked, the government came back and they said, it's because you guys are just too Asian. Their exact words are that the evidence is uncontested that the applicant is a founding member of an Asian band that is self-described and composed of members of Asian descent. Thus, the association of the term slants with Asian descent is evidenced by how the applicant is using the mark as the name of an all Asian band. In other words, they're basically saying, if you go to the slants.com, you'll see photos of Asian people all over it. I'm like, yeah, that's my face. Those are the faces of my band members. But from their perspective, they truly believed that you can't help but associate slant with this obscure racial slur when you see a band that looks like us. And because we sometimes use Asian imagery like dragons or pagodas or artwork from our respective cultural heritage, it just makes way too Asian. I mean, it's a bit ridiculous, and it's kind of another way of saying it is that anyone can register the slants as long as they're not Asian. You know, because the problem is that our band just didn't happen to be a band with a couple of Asian dudes in it. The problem was that our band was like super duper Asian. I mean, we had songs about our culture. We had artwork that had reflected our identity. We aligned with social justice causes that impacted the Asian American community. We used it to connect with audiences and kids growing up trying to explore and find their own identity. So you couldn't separate the idea from who we actually were. And that was the problem, because they said the problem was our imagery, but the imagery was literally our faces. And you can't change that. So we appealed. We said, you can't use somebody's race against them. That's not right. Not to mention that they didn't actually have any evidence. It was just internet memes or dictionaries from the late 1800s. They didn't actually speak to a single Asian American organization about the issue. Now we appealed with all of this, and we lost every single round until we got to the federal circuit, which is just one step below the Supreme Court. At the very last minute, we threw in an argument saying that maybe the trademark office was actually violating our freedom of speech, that they were abridging our First Amendment rights. And at that court, 9 out of 12 federal judges struck down the law as unconstitutional. They agreed with us. So after about 6 years of fighting this, we finally got some dignity out of the process. But months passed and the trademark office refused to do anything with our case. And that's because it turned out that the trademark office and their new BFFs, the Department of Justice, decided to file suit and take me to the final boss stage of the whole legal journey, the Supreme Court. Now, as we were all along, as we've been fighting and appealing this kind of legal case, we kept trying to argue that it should be up to the communities that are affected. We should decide what's best for ourselves, not somebody who has no connection with us whatsoever. I mean, there's all these things I wanted to say that were based on the principle, but principles don't always make very good legal arguments, unfortunately. Still, they mattered to me. They were so important to me. For example, I thought if the Supreme Court's going to be making decisions of what's offensive to some Asian people, well, some Asian people better be up in there. I wanted them to be able to look at us in the eyes and tell us that they knew better than us what was good for our community. And so we kind of crowdfunded our way there. You know, at the end of the day, it might seem that artists don't have that much power. But we can do is use the power that we do have and make it count. And for us, it was all about the music. We decided to release an album calling it The Band Who Must Not Be Named. And we dedicated that record to the US Patent and Trademark Office. We kicked it off with a song called From the Heart, which is really like an open letter to the trademark office, but also to anybody else who just does not believe in the power of reappropriation. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again. There is power in claiming an identity. Our identity is from the heart, and expressing that identity is a human right.
Sorry if our notes too sharp. Sorry if our voice is too raw. But make the pen a weapon and censor our intelligence until our thoughts mean nothing at all. Sorry if you take offense. You made up rules and played pretend. But know your fear change. It's something so strange, but nothing's gonna get in our way. There's no room for your backwards feelings and backyard dealings. We're never gonna settle, and no, we won't remain silent, no. It's our defining moment. We sing from the heart. We sing from the heart, and no, we won't be complacent, no. It's a rock and roll nation. We sing from the heart. We sing from the heart. Sorry if we try too hard to take some power back for ours. The language of oppression will lose to education until the words can't hurt us again. Sorry if you take offense, but silence will not make amends. The system's all wrong, and it won't be long before the kids are singing our songs. There's no room for our backwards feelings and backyard dealings. We're never gonna settle, and no, we won't remain silent, no. It's our defining moment. We sing from the heart. We sing from the heart, and no, we won't be complacent, no. It's a rock and roll nation. We sing from the heart. We sing from the heart.
So much to the chagrin of my attorneys, we actually did play that song on the steps of the Supreme Court. But it was a federal holiday, and they kind of bend the rules on those days. You see, our album was released just a few days before oral arguments at the Supreme Court, right on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. That was the day that we decided to walk up the steps of the court, look out at Capitol Hill, and sing from our hearts. And we decided to celebrate that evening. Wanted to celebrate and honor the legacy of Dr. King by going to the MLK Memorial. We brought our guitars and we gathered with other people there. But while we were there, I also decided to take some time to myself. You see, our legal fight had already spanned over 8 years at this point, almost a decade. And by the time we got to DC, I was the only original band member left. You know, some left because they got girlfriends, some left because the idea of spending a decade stuck in a major legal battle was not what they envisioned for their music career. You know, one by one, they left, but I kept on going. And so while this new band was supportive of this larger effort, they just didn't have those same memories of the beginning that I did when we were super scrappy, when we were just filled with hope and not bogged down by the courts. So I just wanted that time to myself. I walked around and I looked at all these quotes that are carved into stone from Dr. King and just reflected and meditated on them. Eventually, my eyes fell upon my favorite quote of his, which is actually one he quoted from Thomas Poehler, which says that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I remember looking at those words and thinking, you know, that's true. That's true, but the moral arc does not bend on its own. It requires patience, it requires persistence, and most importantly, it requires people willing to step up and fight, no matter how long it might take or how much it might cost. That's how we bend the moral arc of the universe just a little bit more. The next morning, we wake up and we take a ride down to the Supreme Court. I'll never forget stepping out of the car and looking at this building. It's got these huge Roman columns on it, like it's preparing for a gladiator-like combat. At the top of the building, there are 4 words that are inscribed into it: equal justice under law. And I remember looking at those words and saying, I hope that's true today. I hope that's true, because almost every other time that my community came up before this government and this court, we didn't receive anything that looked like justice. I mean, it was the same governing body that said it would be okay to ban people originating from China, treating us like rodents and infecting the population. It was the same governing body that said it would be okay to lock up American citizens of Japanese descent and put them into concentration camps in the name of safety. So I didn't have a lot of faith in the system on that day, but it didn't really matter, because we just get ushered in and all of a sudden we're just sitting in those pews. Now, a lot of people ask me, like, what's it like being at the Supreme Court, especially with your name on the docket? And I gotta say, it's really weird. Like, you got all these Supreme Court justices and the government attorneys all using my name and the name of my band, but they're talking about someone who's creating harm in this country, who's hurting their community, someone who's propagating anti-Asian racism. And I just think, you don't know me. You don't know our band. Like, you weren't there when we decided to work on all of these anti-bullying campaigns. You probably don't even know that we dedicated the profits from our second album to fund research into why Asian American women experience cancer rates 8 times higher than any other demographic group. You weren't there as I was talking to those kids, talking them out of taking their own lives, telling them that things would get better. I was like, you don't know me. You don't deserve to use my name or the name of my band. But I can't say anything at all. I mean, the irony of the whole situation is that I am in America's highest courtroom fighting for freedom of expression. But in that room, I can't actually say a damn thing. So how does it actually feel? Invisible, insignificant. But about halfway through the arguments, there's this little voice that just breaks through. It's Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's asking the government, doesn't it matter that everybody knows the Slants are Asian? They're not using the words to disparage, but to describe and to remove the sting from the term. And I remember thinking, I think I'm in love with a Supreme Court justice. Notorious RBG, she gets it, she's throwing it down. And the only thing that the government could say in response is, well, we found a lot of articles on the internet that suggested otherwise. And I wanted to get up and say, no, you're talking about urbandictionary.com, son. You're not talking about my community. But of course, I couldn't say anything at all. 55 minutes later, and it's over. We're grabbing our stuff out of the lockers, and I'm just thinking, I don't think they get it. I mean, as we walk out of the doors of the front building, past those giant columns and looking down the steps, I notice that the plaza is it's completely filled with people, maybe a couple hundred folks down there. And I'm like, what are they all doing down there? Court's in session. There's no tours today. Like, they don't get it either. But as we're walking out, we're about halfway down those steps, and the crowd looks up and they see us. They begin erupting in applause, cheering for us as we walk down. I'm like, I don't understand what's happening. But as we hit those final steps, these 2 Asian kids run up to me. Simon, our parents led us to school to be here today. And I'm like, what kind of Asian parents do you have? And they're like, no, you don't get it. We're from California. We're freshmen in high school. You see, for our whole lives, we heard about you. We heard about the one who's willing to fight for the dignity of our community, for us to decide what's best for ourselves. We wanted to come here and support you. And we actually waited all night, but there were just too many people. But still, we want to meet you because we wanted to let you know that when we graduate high school, we're going to study public policy development in college. And when we graduate, we're going to run for office And we're going to change the system that you've been fighting against for so long. And I remember thinking, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we win or lose in that courtroom today, because we won where it actually matters most, in the hearts and in the minds of the people most affected by the laws. It's about the long game. It's about changing systems and transforming the culture. And so we join our attorneys who are at the edge of this courtyard where this media circus had gathered with all these cameras and microphones and that sort of thing. All these reporters from all over the world are waiting for some kind of statement from my attorneys. But you know, it was actually their first time at the Supreme Court. Like, we caught them taking selfies up in there. So they didn't actually prepare a statement. My attorneys look over at me and they said, Simon, do you want to say something? And I'm like, absolutely. Because I wanted to say all that stuff that was not mentioned in the courtroom once, all the stuff that was in my heart, all the stuff that was pent up, that all the things that I wish could be made as legal arguments, but really only existed as expressions in my dreams. So I walked up to those microphones and I said, if the government truly cared about fighting against racism while using the trademark office to do so, why didn't they begin by canceling the trademarks for the KKK or Stormfront or actual white supremacist groups? Like, why did they choose to wage this battle against an anti-racist band? Maybe it's because they don't actually care. Maybe it's because they want to use so-called bad language as a distraction from bad policy. You see, we were not the only ones who are too Asian to get a trademark. Or we're not the only ones who want to reclaim our identities. I mean, think about it. Who are the kinds of people that tend to reappropriate language and symbols? It's mostly women, members of the LGBTQ community, and people of color. We understand how empowering it can be to take those stigmatizing labels, to flip them upside down, to say to our oppressors, you don't get to define me. Only I get to do that. But it turns out that it also made us targets under the law. The overwhelming majority of the people who were ruled against using this law were people trying to reappropriate those words. So when we shined a light on this, the government didn't like that. And they tried to put us into a ruin as a result. But we just kept fighting and fighting until it eventually brought us before the High Court. You see, here's the thing about artists, is that we understand there is a process for creating something. Art, like activism, requires a vision. What are you hoping to bring to the world? Often it doesn't happen overnight, and most of the time it requires this unexpected combination of notes or colors to bring it to life, but with one drop of paint at a time, with one note sung at a time. And even with mistakes made along the way, that vision starts to come to life. You see, most people don't realize that the government, the Supreme Court, doesn't actually make its decision on the day that arguments are heard. So as if the road to get there wasn't actually long enough, they usually take a few months to make that decision. So I decided to make use of that time by doing something a bit unconventional. I heard that the clerks of the Supreme Court like to keep their ears to the ground, to hear what public sentiment is and what experts are saying about a topic. So for the next few months, after our day in court, we crammed about 70 appearances in 60 days by speaking at, performing at every law school, bar association, or group of scholars that we could get in front of. We told our story, our own story of what it means to be able to choose our name and the dignity that comes with choosing our own identity. And we made it back in time just for me to actually get married to my very understanding fiance. 3 weeks later, I'm deep asleep and my phone is going wild. It's about 6 a.m. and I have about 700 missed notifications. So I know that something had happened. I hop on Twitter and I see that Oregon Public Broadcasting, the NPR affiliate that first broke the story of an Asian American man that was flipping stereotypes upside down, summed it up in a single tweet. They wrote, "The Supreme Court rules in favor of the slants." Later that day, I found out that the decision was actually unanimous. I spent a lot of time reflecting about that journey and about my own life. And I'd really like to use this time to encourage you to think about your own journey. And as we reflect on that journey of our own lives, I'd like you to think about that path of yours as if it were a song. If it were a song, what would it sound like? What would be the resonating theme for the kind of impression that you would like to leave on this world? What kind of story do you want this song to tell? Most songs have a chorus, an anthem of sorts that kind of serves as the anchor for the rest of the composition to wrap around and to return to. When you think about the song of change for your own life, I want to encourage you to think about it, not in terms of what you're fighting against, but what values you stand for. Because ideas like justice, hope, and compassion are indeed like choruses. They're worth returning to again and again. Let your values by that which connects you to the verses, like let them be the verses, or let the various stories or the chapters of your life express those intricate ideas that ultimately create one beautiful harmony moving forward. As someone who composes music, one of my favorite parts of the song is actually the bridge. The bridge is often used to build energy and momentum before the final chorus comes back in to take us home. When used properly, it is both the turning point and that which pieces everything together, giving more weight and importance to each of the other sections of a song. I believe that tonight is a bridge. Yes, we are celebrating the incredible legacy of Nelson Mandela and the ideas that he stood for. Mandela, who played a critical role in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, demonstrated what is possible when compassion and equity is integrated into every part of the process. And so what I want for you to do tonight is to think about this evening as a bridge for where we move forward as a community, where we move forward as a country. How can your song be a song that invites additional voices, where we can prepare for that big chorus that is just so beautiful, so contagious that people can't help but want to join in? This is the kind of song that we're writing right now. You are that bridge. And just like the land and its people are inseparable, your presence tonight at this event also ties you into the music that is the work of justice. Remember, music is both ceremony and a time capsule. And in that sense, when you bring in efforts of creating social change, whether it is through the joining of a local grassroots organization or marching in solidarity, you are helping to write that song of justice, of dignity, and of community. You are creating the kind of art that endures. That is worth singing about. The song that we're writing right now might be a bit too radical for some people. It may be a bit ahead of our time for others, but nonetheless, it is a song that will be passed on to our children and our children's children, because they are watching. The actions of future generations are echoes based on the values of what is demonstrated through the current generation, through our actions and through our indifference. As Dr. Cornel West famously said, justice is what love looks like in public. And the wonderful thing is that this kind of time capsule isn't just linked to the sentiments of a distant past or an idealistic future. With each and every intentional effort, we're sowing new meaning in so that our communities can enjoy this right now. The other great thing about time capsules and songs is that we can have as many as we'd like. We can continue to create momentum for ideas that matter. June 19th, 2017, Juneteenth of all days, was actually the day that my legal journey ended. And although that destination was reached, it didn't mean that it was over. So what happens after a major Supreme Court case? What does one do? For us, in less than 2 years after that decision, our band actually decided to retire from live touring. I was tired. I mean, the miles just wore us down. But I also realized that all along, music was just a vehicle for a story. The bigger story, the one that I really wanted to tell, was about expression and identity. And so that's why we started the Slants Foundation, so that we could provide scholarship and mentoring to other artists of color who wanted to incorporate activism into their work. We wanted to mentor those future troublemakers. And so maybe that was, in the end, the best thing about starting the Slants, that it became a vehicle for us to be able to create a community and empower another generation. Because it always is about creating a song that endures. That is a song of change. And so tonight, let's work together to serve as a bridge in our communities. Let us complete this song, a song that really is about this land, a land that we're all making, and hopefully a land that can truly be for you and for me.
When the sun comes shining, the night was rolling, and the wheat fields waving, and the dust clouds rolling, the voice come chanting, and the fog was lifting. This land was made for you and me.
Thank you so much for having us this evening.
Thank you so much for sharing your journey with us. It's very inspiring. Just an amazing story, and I hope it's one that can kind of inspire our community here as well. So we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A that have been posted. If anyone in the audience right now has a question, please go ahead and post that. The first one was that someone wants to know what's the name of the song that was used to call out the trademark office.
That song is called From the Heart, and it's on our EP, The Band Who Must Not Be Named.
And someone else asks, when you say there's power claiming our identity, is the power more internal to the individual, or is the power more influential with bringing people together? Is one of these feelings more powerful than the other, or are both equally important?
That's a great question. And the fascinating thing about it is that the answer is really that it is both. So when a person recognizes their own inherent dignity and power, there's this dramatic shift within themselves. And I think that also influences and shapes a lot of their decisions and how they kind of move about this world. But there is also something really fascinating when you look at the studies of reappropriation and reclaiming, in that when community groups claim an identity, there's also a sense of loss of power for dominant groups as well. And I think that's particularly when you talk about language or symbols, I think it's a really fascinating process, because all of a sudden, those groups that are used to having the ability to make decisions around others' identities by either putting them into categories or labels, now all of a sudden they have to check in with those respective communities. And I think it's really kind of a fascinating study, and there's a great psychological study from Alan Galinsky about this, about showing how that power can shift. But I think it is equally important for both the individual as well as the communities that they impact and the communities that we find ourselves in. And we're definitely seeing a lot of shifts around this to this day. And in fact, it's not always unanimous in terms of how people approach the topic, but it is important in that we're having those conversations, whether those are conversations around racial and ethnic identity, sexuality or gender, or any other kind of way that we choose to identify ourselves. It is a process, and I think that's the beautiful and wonderful thing about it, is that that process in of itself holds power.
Thank you. So I have a question for you as well. You mentioned the Ramones early on, and I'm also a fan of the Ramones. And as you probably know, one of the contributing factors to the band breaking up were their political differences between Johnny and Joey. They were at different ends of the political spectrum. So in a sense, we can see how that political disconnect and that tension can actually lead to the stifling of creativity and collaboration. So what advice do you have for people that have others in their life that have very different political viewpoints? How can they find a way to still collaborate with that difference?
I think that we oftentimes have more in common with other people than we realize. And it's a matter of perspective, like an emphasis. You can choose to fixate on the differences that you hold with somebody else, or you can try and reframe things based on in a place where you can inherently connect with them. And I think by focusing on shared values or maybe bigger picture values, that allows that opportunity for connection to exist. So for example, like say the debates around gun control, no matter where one sits on the kind of paradigm in terms of like being in favor or against it, I think most people can agree upon the idea of like safety is paramount and important. And so like fixating on the idea of like, what does it mean to be safe? And beginning with that conversation is like, I know you care about your children. I know you care about your community as I do. Let's like work the conversation from there instead of beginning with assumptions about what one's values might be based on their political values. And it sounds like a subtle shift, but it could be actually pretty dramatic, I think, when engaging in those conversations. And so, I started off sharing the story of like how we kind of connected with that white supremacist. And it turns out that over the years, I've kind of become a magnet for white supremacists to reach out to me for some reason or another. So much so where I eventually gave a TED talk called How to Talk with a White Supremacist. And I think a lot of it had to do with my own anti-racism work. They thought they would troll me and that sort of thing. And what many of them found surprising was that I just started chatting with them. I'd be like, hey, you want to meet up for coffee? And I would start asking them questions. And because they're just so used to trying to provoke a response and they're so used to people being antagonistic or defensive, that when someone actually wanted to hear more about them, it caught them off guard. And as we kind of started having those conversations, I started digging in. I started realizing behind those stories of hate, there's probably a story of pain, of sorrow, of sadness. And what might that be? What is that thing that could, maybe elicit some feelings of humanity in that person? And as we'd have those conversations, and as I just started asking them questions, they came to realize that they came to kind of started seeing the humanity in me as well. And I'm not the only person in this. There's actually a lot of people who are doing fantastic work in this area, particularly this nonprofit called Life After Hate, which is of former white supremacist members who actually reach out and recruit current white supremacist members and getting them to leave and by sharing the story with them of their own kind of personal journey. So there are, as amazing as it sounds, like opportunities for us to connect, even when we seem to be at complete opposite sides of some kind of political spectrum or some kind of identity when it comes to our values. We just have to tap into that. And I think there's something inherently that connects people. And if we could find out what that is and lean on that, it will provide us with these opportunities to build community.
Thank you. Another question, do you feel like the idea of claiming your identity is evolving through generations? For example, do you feel this is something that has always been important, or is this gaining importance with younger generations?
That's a great question. When actually was studying the history of reappropriation, it actually goes back thousands and thousands of years. And it pops up in many different forms, whether it's through icons or through language. I think there's this idea of the underdog saying like, hey, you can't use this, you can't weaponize this against me. I'm going to use it and claim it and turn it around. So I think that it's existed for quite some time, but I think because of its effectiveness, because it's kind of permeated almost every culture, that it's becoming more and more known. There's also the process that kind of struggles around identity and the momentum and progress made in that area, I think has accelerated to the point where we recognize that process. We see what someone's doing, particularly if they're using maybe a language in a subversive way, whether it's through irony or satire, parody, or through this kind of act of reappropriation, we can recognize that even if when we disagree with it, we can recognize that process. So I think it is becoming more common and more widely acceptable. And I think particularly in the arts, both visual art as well as literature and music, like that is also contributing to it being more widespread and used in a way that is as effective, sometimes controversial, but certainly a way that is seeding conversations to take place, important ones at that.
Along those same lines, someone wants to know what's the best way to discuss with others that claiming our identity isn't a bad thing. They want to know about that some people might find it difficult to have that conversation with the fear of backlash, especially from people the individual care about.
Yeah, I think whenever anyone is afraid of having a difficult conversation, and this is something that I think we find ourselves trying to navigate more and more in this society, is beginning from a place of honesty and of curiosity. And so, for example, a lot of folks recognize that we've been having a lot more conversations around race and identity, particularly in the wake of George Floyd. But I think sometimes some people have felt like it was safer to not have that conversation at all. So in many organizations, there were that have been led by dominant identities, rather than asking if their staff was okay, they would just not say anything at all. And that silence sometimes could be louder than missteps. I think what would have been more effective is if people would have said hey, I might mess this up. I'm just really, really trying to connect with you in the spaces. And then can I ask you some questions about this experience? Or are you okay? This is coming from a place of love and compassion, particularly if one is struggling with the identity of someone else or how they're identifying themselves. Oftentimes just ask, say hey, what is your preferred way of identifying yourself? It's the same thing as if somebody has a preferred nickname or something like that. You use that name out of respect for the individual. And by deliberately ignoring somebody's preferred pronouns or racial identity, it's oftentimes a sign of disrespect. So just taking the time to ask, just like you would yourself to be addressed in a particular way, extending that same courtesy for others could be kind of a really, really important process. So I oftentimes say if you're unsure, ask questions. And if you're afraid of messing up, name that in advance. And then if somebody corrects you, thank them for it. I was in this really powerful training in just a few months ago when people were talking about how to deal with labels around gender. And one of the things that they had recommended was if you accidentally misgender somebody, instead of apologizing, when you're corrected, thank them for it. And that way it takes the emphasis off of any kind of feelings of awkwardness, and it emphasizes that thankfulness, or that the position of gratitude, is one that is actually moving forward rather than one that is moving backward. So I think anytime we can do that, it's a good thing.
Okay, we've had a couple of questions about how to get started as an activist. So if someone wants to, say they're on a college campus and they want to get involved in advocacy work, what advice do you have for them to get started?
I give the same advice to activists as I do with artists. I say, begin with the change that you would like to see. What are the ideas that you care about? What would you like to see expressed? And kind of work backwards from there. So if you have a particular cause that you would like to champion, whether it's environmental justice or freedom of expression or anything else, figure out who are the other people who hold similar values that you would like to be in conversation with. You can use great resources like Charity Match or Volunteer Match and find places that are looking for volunteers, attend events from organizations, whether they're student groups or local community groups, and see if you like what they're doing, if it seems to resonate with what you would like to be involved with. And show up and ask, like, how can I help? How can I be a part of this? And that's usually just kind of the easiest way to kind of get involved. I almost always also recommend that people focus in on their local areas. There are a lot of great national organizations, don't get me wrong. I partner and work with many of them, but like finding someone who is in your area can provide a great network as well as a connection with people. And it's probably going to affect your day-to-day life more than the kind of national conversations. And plus, it's an easier way to get started, particularly because many smaller organizations that are local tend to be more scrappy, and there's really good opportunities for you to help shape the work that they do and to really be able to make a meaningful contribution to that cause as well.
Thank you. So I have another question for you, just kind of a curiosity of your opinion on this, because the band The Chicks, formerly the Dixie Chicks, of course, they were started in the late 80s. So they obviously didn't have that same issue with the patent office. Do you think that's because of the time that it was that we just weren't as woke, politically alert to these kinds of issues? Or do you think it's because the patent office didn't see chicks as a disparaging term for women?
I think it's more the latter. I mean, it's really difficult to, if you, I'll say as a like trademark office, those attorneys, they're just kind of underwater. I mean, they get over 300,000 applications a year and they get very little time to review. And so in many ways, we're actually expecting them to kind of understand language and identity in ways that they've never been trained for or understand themselves. So usually if they flag something under like the old provision of law, it was because they might have personally overheard it rather than being fully aware of things. And it's also one of the reasons why legislating language generally doesn't work well when it comes to the government, because identities shift, language changes, how people engage with words and identity is constantly moving. And so to have like a fixated point, even if you were to provide that like adequate training, well, you probably need to train them over and over and over again. So in regards to the Dixie Chicks, there've been like all kinds of stuff. In fact, there have been like hundreds and hundreds of like porn companies that have registered their trademarks. So one could say like, hey, these are pretty sexualized or certainly immoral or scandalous terms. But for one reason or another, they were just rubber stamped on the way through. And then for many groups, particularly nonprofits and artists who tried to use those same terms, they were almost always denied. And I think maybe it's because they weren't coming from a larger company. They just got additional scrutiny. So, there are a lot of like, I think, barriers inherent into the process. And certainly one of which is just that it's a messy process. And when you have a law like that, it's going to get pretty messy, especially when you don't have people from those respective communities involved with the decision-making process. But you find that whether it's language or any other kind of law involving people's identities and how they, engage with society.
Thank you. Another question from a participant is asking essentially, when you're having these tough conversations or when you're doing advocacy work, how do you avoid coming across too harshly? How do you, rein in the hostility and maintain composure and professionalism when you're doing that?
I think at the end of the day, it's important to remember and to try and seek the humanity and dignity of other people. I mean, it's like, it kind of go in some ways, it goes back to the golden rule, like how would we like to be treated, or how would we like to treat our loved ones or see them treated? We tend to give grace to people who we are in relationship with. We tend to give them a little bit more leeway when it comes to things, particularly if they say something incorrectly or do something, because we have that built-in relationship. So I think if we want to move the needle with communities, whether they are ones that we identify in and participate in, or they're ones that we want to work with, we need to be able to extend grace and build up those relationships. That it's kind of fascinating when you think about like racial and ethnic terms and identities, like I mentioned earlier, like they're in movement pretty often. For many years, particularly as I started getting in my work around arts and activism, people use the term people of color to refer to kind of non-white groups that exist in this country. And it was a term that was originated out of Black radical feminists in the 70s to kind of show solidarity amongst people of colors. But then over the last few years, you see this term BIPOC become more and more common, Black, Indigenous people of color, to try and recognize that certain groups have experienced different types of hardship and trepidation that other community groups might not have experienced in the same kind of way. But the reality is that, like, when you're working in community, you more often than not just know each other by your names, by your individuals. When you have relationship with people, it's like the labels all of a sudden don't matter quite so much. And how you go about doing the work, or the even how you communicate with each other, probably doesn't matter quite as much as the fact that you are working together, because you have that relationship in existence and that you can fall back upon. Now, of course, it also, part of being in a relationship means that if you do mess up and someone holds you accountable by, correcting you or trying to provide some guidance in some kind of way, that you're welcome, that you accept that kind of guidance. So I almost always say, like, find a way to develop and deepen relationship with people in a meaningful kind of way, in a way that provides grace, and in a way that provides accountability. And when you do that, you kind of naturally soften your approach anyway, because you're like, oh, this is the person I care about, or these are the people that I really want to work with. I'm going to be extra cautious. And, you can kind of clarify that intention in advance with people as well. And usually when you say, like, I hope I'm not coming across this particular way, I just want to clarify my intention, this is what I would like to do. They tend to more often than not give you the benefit of the doubt than if you're just, slapping it down.
Thank you very much. I guess one last question before we let you go today, and that's my understanding is that you are now living in Nashville, Tennessee. Is that correct?
Actually, I moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, so I'm not in the Midwest.
Okay. So how are you finding that transition from East Coast to Midwest, and the difference that you see politically, and what's your reception been in these communities?
Well, I love living in the Midwest. I think that, I kind of shared early in my story that Portland is not like super diverse. And even though people assume it's this kind of liberal bubble, it can make it difficult to navigate at times. So I actually love the diversity of the South and the Midwest, something that people assume that doesn't actually exist, but it's actually pretty vibrant. And I love the communities that are here, because we're able to connect with one another easily. And it's great food and culture and all that. I think that it's also living in a swing state, living in a place where, like, Cincinnati in particular is about 50-50 when it comes to those who identify as Republican versus those who identify as Democrat. It's still a city that works quite well. And I think it's because people see each other as neighbors and as fellow members of the community, rather than inherently on the blue or the red spectrum initially. It's so easy to just kind of dismiss someone for one small part of their identity. And I think that here, I've been seeing people work together beyond that. And it's a fantastic reminder that says, like, we do care at the end of the day about the same things. We oftentimes just disagree in how we get to that destination. So if we can find ways to share those values and expression of those values, then I think we're all better off for it. That doesn't mean that we don't have a long way to go, but it is refreshing to see that taking place, at least in certain segments of the population here. So I'm grateful to be a part of this, and I hope to continue to bring more attention and art to the Midwest.
Well, thank you so much. And since you are so close in Cincinnati, if you ever find yourself in our area, please, you are welcome to come to our campus and we would love to meet you in person as well. I believe our community has really appreciated all that you've brought us today, and we are just really grateful to have you share in this this special day with us on our campus. So thank you to both of you for coming and bringing your talents with us today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we would be honored to come there and both bring our guitars as well.
Yes, absolutely. We would love it.